All right, so welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at the idea of form, all right, and remembering that form is about 3 dimensions and how space and energy work together in order to kind of create the idea of how figures or objects interact in space. So, our learning goals for today, we're going to be making sure that we can identify key characteristics or qualities of form, okay? And these include the idea of open and closed form, dynamic and static, right? We're also going to be thinking about the relationship between the type of form that is being used, open or closed, versus the visual energy that is applied, which is dynamic or static, right? And we're going to be looking at being able to make sure that we can identify how these particular concepts are being used in the works that we're going to be taking a look at today. Okay, so what is form? Hey, first and foremost, we need to remember form is 3-dimensional. It has height, width, and depth, and it exists in space. And because that it exists in space, we also need to understand and think about that it therefore also has spatial relationships. Okay, forms have actual or implied mass. We can kind of get a sense of how heavy something is, right? And it also has a surface, and we need to be thinking about the textures that are sitting on top of those surfaces. Okay? So now that we have an idea of what form is, let's jump in and think about how it can be used. Okay, so first of all, we have open forms, in which there's a kind of a balance of positive and negative space in and around the figure. Right? I always like to think of the idea that there are windows in open forms that allow me to see through this, in this case, kind of the sculptural work, right, in order to create a more dynamic or energetic composition, right? So these little windows I'm talking about would include sort of these negative spaces in here, 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 through here, right between the legs, etc. Right? So the idea of openness is also kind of like there's windows that allow you to see past the form as well, right? So often we think of sculptures being created out of some material like clay or marble, right? And that there's a sense that it's not just one solid block, right? There's more delicate or intricate pieces, right? But most importantly, open forms, they tend to extend out into space, right? There's a reaching that happens. Closed forms, on the other hand, okay, are the outer contour is pretty simple, right? So in this piece here from pre-ancient Greece, the Cycladic culture, right, we have a very simple outer contour, right? The arms are bound in together, the right elbows are kept close to the sides of the body, the knees are close together, the ankles are close together, right? So that there's an increased sense of the overall mass of the object, right? It looks visually a little bit heavier because those windows that we saw in the previous example aren't there in order to visually lighten the object. Okay, so the objects can be, or sculptures can be open or form, or figures or forms can be open or closed, right? And those are kind of I'm going to call them the types of forms that we have. But then we also have the energy, right? And a dynamic form has a lot of apparent motion. So in this example, right, we see that there's a lot visually happening. Arms are reaching out, people are looking in different directions, right? There's the crouching person, the person that's being grasped, or the woman that's being grasped, the man standing over top of somebody else, right? Is really, really busy. And if you were to imagine walking around this particular piece of sculpture, right, the outer contour of all of the different limbs that are extending out into space would be constantly changing. And by having those really elaborate outer contours, it creates that sense of energy or that dynamism in the particular piece, okay? So we have dynamic, which means high energy, but we also have the idea of the static form, which is almost like the idea of the frozen figure, right? And in ancient Greece, right, there's the impression that the figure here is starting to take a step, but it's not overly defined, right? His knees are still locked, his arms are straight down at the side, everything's at kind of angles, right, which makes it a little bit more challenging for the idea that this couple are actually walking, right? So static kind of means that they are frozen in time, so to speak. Okay? So how do these two concepts interact with each other, right? We have the idea of how a form occupies the space, whether it's open or closed, and we also have the energy of the form, whether it's static or dynamic, right? And we can combine these forms together in different ways in order to create visual variety in our work, right? So for example, right, okay, so for example, if I were to take a look at this piece here that we saw, okay, first thing that I want you to do is to determine whether or not, or think about how this figure is occupying space, right? And we already know that from our previous discussion that this figure is dynamic. So it's going to be in one of these two here, right? But is it closed or is it open? I would probably argue that this figure is actually what we would refer to as an open and dynamic form. Okay. Our second example here that we could take a look at is from the Cycladic culture, right? And we talked about whether or not this form was basically open or closed, right? So we know that it was closed. Is it static closed or is it dynamic closed, right? And again, right, this one here I would probably be placing in this quadrant, right? It is a static closed form. Okay? We also have, when we talked about this one being static form, is it open or closed? And this is the ancient Egyptian example, right? Again, right, we know it's static, right? The outer contour is fairly simple, which would kind of lead us to think about it being down in this quadrant here. Right? And lastly, we have the Laocoon from ancient Greece as well. And here we talked about it being a dynamic form and the fact that it has windows, right? We also know that it is kind of like a little bit more on the open side, right? So they work together in different kinds of ways. So I have another test sample image for us to take a look at. And this one's a little bit more interesting, right? Because here we need to figure out, is this particular image going to be open or closed? And once we figure out whether it is open or closed, then we'll start thinking about whether it is static or dynamic. Okay? So for me, I would say that this is an image that is, it's actually kind of open, right? So I'm going to place it in this column, or sorry, this row here. Okay? Right? And the reason that I'm saying that this is an open form is because we do have these little bits of negative space in between. Right? And from here, I would assess that this image is actually a little bit more static. Right? It does have the busy contour, but when I look at the figure as a whole, the figure is standing, right? The knees are locked, the arms are straight and rigid, right? So despite the fact that the outer contour is busy, which we typically think of as a dynamic form, right? The overall sense that this particular figure is giving is that it is kind of solid and static. My interpretation at the very least, right? You could also make an argument that it is over here on this side, that it's dynamic, right? What you do need to be aware of is that sometimes there's not always going to be a perfectly 100% correct answer, right? What you want to get used to is understanding what the criteria are and how you are interpreting those criteria based on the visual evidence that you're seeing in the works that are being presented. All right, so quick summary. We have two ways of thinking about forms, right? Or those three-dimensional subjects. Number one is, how does that form occupy the space? Is it contained or does it extend, right? Closed versus open. And the second criteria that we want to think about is, what is the visual energy that the form has? Is it static or is it dynamic? Is there that sense of movement? Hopefully this gives you a few things to think about as you're considering how to draw or sculpt the various forms that you're going to include in your pieces. If you have any questions, please make sure that you're asking, and as always, have a great day. Bye.